Hey everybody, we're here with Exploring World History, lesson number 12. And we're just going to talk about Egypt and just the generic aspects of Egypt to start with, kind of a very quick overview, okay? First thing we want to talk about is where is Egypt? Hopefully you can find it on a map. But it's in the northeast corner of Africa. It's near the Middle East, and it's adjacent to the Mediterranean, okay? The central reality of all Egypt, the main part of all Egypt that kind of gives most of Egypt its reasoning and its cities and things is the Nile River. Okay? So you can't talk about Egypt without talking about the Nile River. It is the longest river in the entire world. It starts in Central Africa at Lake Victoria and is 4,132 miles long. Flows into the Mediterranean, so it starts in the south and flows north into the Mediterranean Sea. This river breaks Egypt into basically two very distinct sections. The Upper Egypt, which is in the south and closer to the origin of the river, and it's also part of a valley area. And then Lower Egypt, which is near the Mediterranean and much more flat. This area also has the river's delta, and the delta starts about 100 miles from the coast, and it's filled with silt and other minerals and nutrients from the river. The area around the Nile is very important and has always been very important to Egypt and the Egyptians. Immediately around the Nile is very rich farmland, and it's caused from the floods. Every summer the river floods, and it happens because of the rain and the melting snow in the mountains in the south. And then as it floods, it would fill this area with silt and other things, and then as it receded, it's what created the wonderful farmland. There were times, though, where the flooding caused all kinds of problems for the Egyptians, and maybe, there was too much flood, or there wasn't, enough flood. They couldn't control the flooding. So in 1970, they built the Anzawat High Dam, and now they're able to control the flooding and use the water to their advantage. The water does provide certain things, water and food specifically. Also some navigational things and whatever, but specifically let's talk about the water and food. In Egyptian lore, Osiris is the god who ruled the Nile, the god that was in charge of the Nile. And the water gave them drinking water, and it also gave them irrigation water that was able to help them build their food and crops. Some of the food they get from the Nile itself is fish and fowl, the birds that come to the water and around the edges of the water that they could hunt and eat. But also, as we talked a little bit before, the the crops that would grow from the flooding in the areas around the Nile that was really good farmland. The Egyptian people, like we talked about a minute ago, they had the god of the Nile. They had a very distinct and very unique set of religious beliefs. Okay, they were also very deeply religious people. They worshiped their different gods, polytheistic, and they was central to the lives that they lived. Okay, polytheistic means the worship of many gods, and some of their gods were much more important than others. And in other lessons we'll talk some more about the different gods. But what is important to know is it's very essential to their everyday way of life, and because of so, sometimes their worship of the gods became political. Each region had its own specific god, and each region was trying to fight and dominate for control. So there was times when people claimed different areas or took over different areas, they would force their gods on the other people. One example of that is the Pharaoh Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti in 1375 BC. They worshiped the sun god known as Ra, and once they conquered the areas, they forced the monotheistic worship of Ra on everybody. That lasted just a few years until Tutankhamun became pharaoh, and at that point he gave up the forced worship of Ra and reinstituted the polytheistic worship. Okay, so And there's other occurrences of that happening in different parts of Egypt, the entirety of Egypt. So just know that regardless of who was in charge, the worshiping of different gods was extremely important, and it affected their afterlife. The Egyptian afterlife was very important to all Egyptians, but specifically to the pharaohs and the people would be considered more important in society. And so therefore they created a well-developed system about life after death. What they believed was that at death they were judged by Osiris of whether they had good deeds or bad deeds. If they had too many bad deeds, they would be eaten by a monster. If they were deemed to have enough good deeds, or their good deeds outweighed their bad deeds, they would enter into a happy existence after life. They believed the soul of a person needed that body, though, in the afterlife. And therefore, that's how they started getting into the embalming, trying to preserve that body and save that body for the afterlife. And then we got to the mummification that, Egypt is famous for, because they wanted to make sure the bodies of the deceased were prepared for the afterlife and preserved for the afterlife so that they could live forever. And also, not just they needed their bodies, but they needed supplies and other provisions for the afterlife. So often they would be buried with food and supplies. Sometimes they're servants, sometimes they're different animals that they had. And so they all wanted to make sure that they had everything they needed in the afterlife. Going back to the pharaohs, though, the pharaohs were, like I said, the most important people in Egypt. They were seen as gods and had absolute power. All the land belonged to the pharaohs. And if we get into just a brief history of some of the pharaohs and some of the kingdoms, we'll talk about the earliest periods. They were just villages along the Nile River. Eventually, some of these became city-states, and they were mostly amongst themselves, but as they started to grow, they started to come together, and then there was fighting that occurred. And then eventually we had the Old Kingdom. And Menes of Upper Egypt conquered the lower Nile Delta region and unified Egypt under one government. He placed his capital at Memphis, which was near the Delta, and this Old Kingdom period lasted about 900 years. After that, Egypt fell into a little bit of chaos, and there's this period of instability. Eventually, we get to the Middle Kingdom, and during the Middle Kingdom, the capital was moved to Thebes. And there was several very strong dynasties that occurred during this time. Then, after these dynasties kind of fell out of power, we have another period of instability with a lot of chaos and problems going on. And then eventually we get to the New Kingdom. And like I said, a lot of that, is just an overview, so we'll discuss a lot more of that in other lessons. Then let's talk briefly about their advancement in writing. They had developed a way to communicate and to record information in a written form. We know that as hieroglyphics, okay? They're sacred carvings. The couple different forms of hieroglyphics, though, that some people may not know. The first is hieratic. It was the earliest form of writing and used primarily by the priests. And a lot of people didn't read or understand that part. Then you had demotic hieroglyphics, and that was a later form. And this was a form used by more people, kind of everyday people. And so there was these two different forms. One was more formal, one was more for everyday people, the hieratic and the demotic. And these lasted for quite a while, but for a very long period of time, we had no idea what they meant. They had lost their meaning for about 1,500 years. Then, the strange thing occurred during the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had his troops basically in the region, and in 1799, he finds this very large slab of rock, okay? He was looking at it, and ultimately has an official decree from about 200 BC. There's 3 forms of writing on it: Greek, hieratic, and demotic. And eventually this gets in the hands of educated people who are studying the rock, and they're trying to figure out what it is. And we now know this as the Rosetta Stone. It took them about 20 years to translate it, but once they did, it opened up all kinds of possibilities because people were then able to translate other hieroglyphics and things, and so they were able to discover and learn so much about the Egyptian history. And the Rosetta Stone is now on display in the British Museum. Some of the things that helped them being the Egyptians, to be able to contribute to writing and be able to write was the papyrus plant, first and foremost. It grew kind of wild all over the place along the Nile River, and they would take these and cut them into long 1-inch strips and lay them side by side on top of each other, next to each other, and smooth them out and let them dry. And once they dried, it created a writing surface, and it gives us our current name, paper. Because they were able to do so, they created a large body of literature from that time. Not only did they create records and government information, but they were able to create a lot of literature. And especially during their times of peace, so people would be able to write and just kind of, tell about what was happening in their lives, or kind of autobiographies, things. And so some of the things we've learned is just an overview of Egypt here, and knowing that because of the Rosetta Stone and the hieroglyphics, we're able to know a lot more about Egypt than we used to. Thanks.